Disclaimer: I do not own the rights of any of the videos, images, or sounds other than my own voice that will be portrayed in this video. Everything you will see is for documentary purposes only and is protected under the Fair Use Act of 1976. The world events of our society's history are always available for screenwriters and directors to create depictions for representation in film. The most important and monumental milestones we read about in history books are open to interpretation and dramatization. Few events are left off limits. Many smaller moments are left untouched since they might not have as much substance to make a film out of, and some have more than one attempt made in the name of accuracy. After the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center, America was left mourning while we cleaned off our wounds and made plans for the future. Only 5 years later, we would see the first film about those events come out. And then another, and then another. Films regarding victims of those who lost someone in the attacks were coming out. Even a film regarding the assassination of the leader of the terrorist group behind the attack came out barely a year after it was announced to the world. June 1944, Operation Neptune occurs. The Normandy landings of US soldiers during World War II, also known as D-Day. By 1950, the first film depicting soldiers during the D-Day events is released, Breakthrough. By 1962, The Longest Day is released, which is based on a memoir of Cornelius Ryan about the events of D-Day. And there are a copious amounts of other films revolving around this event alone, not to mention the films regarding the events of World War II as a whole. These are just a couple examples of this idea. However, there are often examples that are over-dramatized and get ridiculed for historical inaccuracies for one reason or another. Gladiator from 2000 was a tremendous film, going on to win 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actor. Unfortunately, the major portions of the story are completely fictional. The character of Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, does not exist in historical context. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius is depicted as being killed by his son Commodus, which is false. Even the character of Commodus, played by Joaquin Phoenix, has character traits that are highly over-exaggerated of what the history books say. And since Maximus is not real, how does Commodus die? Well, it isn't in the middle of an arena dueling with a gladiator. A more recent example would have to be Netflix's Queen Cleopatra miniseries, which depicts the historical figure as an African American. This sparked a tremendous amount of controversy, in part the Egyptian community, who claimed that it was not an appropriate representation of their culture. Unfortunately, the idea of inaccurate portrayals and taking various liberties are not restricted to historical related movies either. Ghost in the Shell is a beloved manga series that came out in 1991. It has since stapled itself as a must for any anime fan, with its continued manga series, anime TV shows and films, even a video game. But in 2017, a live-action adaptation was released to a tremendous amount of backlash, specifically targeted at the casting choice of actress Scarlett Johansson as the main character, Major Motoko. Fans consider this to be what's called whitewashing, which is something a lot of Hollywood is labeled for when it comes to movies about our past or from other countries. This film caught a lot of heat for this, which brings up the discussion of when is it whitewashing and when is it adaptation. There is an area of creativity where some things might be closed off to a point, but others are open to adapt for different audiences. The Ring is a psychological paranormal horror film from 2002. It's a film a lot of people love for its unique story of a haunted VHS tape that after you watch, you get a phone call that tells you you're going to die in 7 days. It probably had a lot of people nervous to answer their phones after watching it. But this isn't an original idea. It's a remake of a 1998 Japanese film, Ring, or Ringu. It's the same movie, but what we got here is made for our demographic. This is one of the many examples of stories that American writers and directors have remade from overseas for American audiences. Every film I've mentioned so far is purely examples of how, whether it is based on real events or being of fictional nature, it still has to be faithful to its source of inspiration. And a point I made a moment ago regarding America's film record, unfortunately, holds more examples of how our culture led to making too many films in our own light, despite trying to tell the real story. And those inaccuracies and choices led a lot of films to be a shameful mark in our cinema's history. The worst of the worst would have to be The Conqueror from 1956. It tells the events of how the Mongol known as Chief Temujin steals the daughter of a rival leader, Borte, which incites war. This is historically inaccurate, as Borte and Temujin were an arranged marriage, and Temujin was meant to work off the price to marry her by being a slave to her father until the debt was settled. This was the early life of Temujin before he would rise to become Genghis Khan. Let's leave all of that aside though, because that is the least of this film's problems. This film has one of the most egregious examples of whitewashing in any American film, and probably in all of film history. The history of Genghis Khan is of the Asian culture. Who portrays him in this film? John Wayne, famous Western actor. They put a traditional Asian-styled mustache on him, which was depicted of emperors of that time, and spray-tanned him darker to look not so much like the American actor he was. However, they could not spray-tan his voice.
My son?
Not so, fine gazelle.
Now we seek bigger game, Hunlin.
How many markets did you observe?
30? No more.
We'll take twice that number. Kolbagurchi and Savaya.
There is no way this film will ever have a positive thing to say about it because of this. It is such a horrible mark on the name John Wayne, as there are still so many who love and revere him to this day.
Okay, ready? I'm John Wayne at the first Thanksgiving, pilgrims. Happy Thanksgiving, pilgrims.
You might think this being the worst depiction of Genghis Khan is bad, but it was so bad, there has never been another Americanized version of this story. The closest you get is when he pops up in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, but that's not meant to be taken seriously. Otherwise, every film that has been made based on the reign of Genghis Khan is done by a Chinese production studio, and after this atrocity, it's rightfully so. It was directed by Dick Powell, who was an actor from the mid-30s up until the early 50s when he went into directing instead. This was his second of only 5 films he ever directed, and the rest are not very successful either. Alas, the sad nature of this film does not stop there. Behind the scenes, there was more trouble with this film that might hint to someone that perhaps this movie was cursed from the beginning. The film was shot in St. George, Utah. This location is around 140 miles away from the U.S. Nevada National Security Site, a location where reported 11 nuclear bombs were tested in 1953. The Conqueror was released in 1956, to which its filming was started in 1954. St. George is also, regrettably, downwind of this site. The radiation remnants from the bomb testing had traveled down into the production of the film, causing the cast and crew to get radiation poisoning. Some would go on to develop cancer over the years that followed. In total, 91 people out of those 220 involved in this film's production had suffered from cancer or cancer-related illnesses, 46 succumbing to their disease. Howard Hughes, the producer of the film, was said to have felt so guilty from this, he bought every single print of the film that was out, costing a total of $12 million. He kept the film out of circulation until 1979, when the film was purchased from his estate by Universal Pictures. Between casting choices, production debacles, directorial inadequacies, this film seems to be destined to never be spoken about in a positive light, ever. You could just stop at the whitewashing and say this movie is not worth it just for that. But you can't ignore the poor decision making on the production's part to film at a location with no regards to what else was happening. A professor from the University of Utah, Dr. Robert Pendleton, apparently made this statement regarding the incident. With these numbers, this case could qualify as an epidemic. The connection between fallout, radiation, and cancer in individual cases has been practically impossible to prove conclusively. But in a group this size, you'd expect only 30-some cancers to develop. With 91 cancer cases, I think the tie-in to their exposure on the set of The Conqueror would hold up in a court of law. Basically, he's saying that if 1 out of every 10 people get cancer, that's normal. But this was nearly every 5 out of 10 people, which is so abnormal, there has to be another factor involved. This was said in 1980, 24 years after the fact, and probably around the time the number of deaths was becoming substantial. There was no comment ever given from the government agency regarding these events. To be frank, they never made any comments regarding those who were experiencing health problems due to the Nevada bomb tests in general, so there's no surprise there. Many surviving cast and crew members, as well as the relatives of the cancer victims, considered filing for a major lawsuit against the government for their negligence, claiming they knew more about the hazardous conditions than they let on. Nothing ever came of it, though. Out of so many examples of the heinous choices made by Hollywood throughout history, this has to be one of the most unfortunate cases ever. And you know what the most disappointing part of this entire piece of history is? Not only does this film make John Wayne look bad, not only is it the prime example of a lot that is wrong in Hollywood, not only is it a stain on American film history, but there is a sad truth behind it all. The truth of the unfortunate souls who lost their lives just to assist in producing a movie that would go down in history as probably the worst film ever made. Those who became sick on that set are lamented in this film's record. Think about being hired for a film. Your only focus is on how it's going to be a regular movie, and you never realize your fate until it's too late. No one expects or wishes for a movie to fail, but no one walks onto a set hoping it doesn't kill them either. The list of films that have this unlucky fate attached to them is not small, but on this scale, there are few that come close. Never will The Conqueror be mentioned in any discussion, and the memory of those who suffered from this tragedy will not be mentioned along with it.
You do well, Kumlik, for while I have fingers to grasp a sword and eyes to see, your treacherous head is not safe on your shoulders.